Hi everyone, and we're back as promised. And with us on our virtual stage A is Shanea, founder and CEO at CodeSee. Welcome, Shanea.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, and we are very happy that you join us at DevExConf. So Shanea is based in California and has really an illustrious career in tech at lots of leading companies such as Google, eBay, Cloudflare, Docker, Lob, and those were just a couple of them. So really very impressive. But now you're here with your own company.
That's
And
right.
the topic of your talk is code reviews is more than a crushing developer experience. So I think this will be right kind of in the middle between. So we have a duality at DevExConf this year between the tools and the other things that make a good developer experience. And I think we will learn something on both topics. This is going out onto YouTube, but also onto Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see if you have any questions. Or those watching, feel free to write them in the comments on YouTube. Those are the ones that we read, and we will pick them up. So I will get off the stage, and yeah, great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited. Hi, everyone. As Michael said, my name is Shanea. I'm the founder and CEO of CodeSee. So I want to start off by telling a quick story. Jonah, he was one of the first engineers at this company. After the team grew to about 20 people, some of the early sections of the code remained, and there were only 2 to 3 people at the company who truly understood how it worked. Jonah was assigned to clean up that section of the code to make it easier to understand so other people could actually work in it. He toiled away on his own and posted a truly massive code review. Thousands and thousands of lines of code had been changed. He'd posted the change, and then he, wrote up a little blurb that said, this should make it easier to understand. Felt super proud that he could really make the code better. But then he asked Ryan to review it. Ryan had other stuff to do besides this giant code review. But Ryan also wanted that code to be easier to understand for everybody. So, carves out time and started working his way through it. Hours and hours, Ryan read it and read it. He started posting comments, asking questions, but eventually he started to get super frustrated. As he got more and more frustrated at this giant task, his comments became angrier and angrier. And Jonah tried to respond to them all, but those comments made Jonah feel less and less appreciated. After a while, Ryan gave up. This was just too big of change, and he just ran out of time. And after that day, months and months go by, and the code just sat there. So Jonah ended up being pretty frustrated, but he couldn't force Ryan to spend more time on the code review. He put in a lot of time and care into this thing, and genuinely just wanted to be helpful. And it seemed like the only options were to either skip the code review or never merge the code. And the truth is, code reviews kind of suck. How many of you have had a bad experience with code reviews? They suck for many reasons. Like Jonah and Ryan's story, the code review can just be way too big. Even if it's not huge, wrapping your head around the review can seem really hard. And once you do understand the change, the back and forth between the author and the reviewer can be really stressful, especially when you're trying to hit a deadline. Oh, seems like you can't see. One sec. Sure. Hopefully everyone can see now. Perfect. Okay, awesome. So I want to talk to you today about 3 steps to make a better code review process. Make a nicer maze, make a map, and have empathy. But before we get to the solution, why are code reviews hard in the first place? Typically, we think about a code review as a 3-step process. First, you create, you transfer, and then you unpack. So with creating, which is like writing the code, we need to create it, but we do everything in our heads. And our heads are really busy and really cluttered. Our heads are not only filled with brilliance and skills to manifest something out of nothing, but we're also plagued with biases and judgments and experiences and anxieties. Transferring means sharing your understanding with somebody else. We need to share the mental models that are in our heads with someone else, and that makes it really, really challenging. We don't have something to rally around, and our tools make it really, really hard to be able to literally take a mental model from one person and give it to another. And finally, unpacking. Unpacking is code review, getting that mental model out of someone's head and into the reviewers, but also to like convert and agree that the way that you've done things is the right way to move forward. And it's important to remember that talking to people is different than talking to computers, because people, we've got like feelings and stuff. Turns out, even this process, or the way that we think about things today, is not enough for your code reviews to have the impact that our code reviews should be having. So what's missing? At a fundamental level, our experience of a code review is actually deeply reflective of the general human experience. We're all just like trying to learn and to grow and to connect with each other. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of what I mean. So this is Andrea. She's a senior engineer and she just started a new job at this super high profile startup. She was brought in for her experience in Go. And not only does she just want to make a good impression, but doesn't want to let her team down. I'm sure like many of you. The nature of a high profile startup is that it's just like every other startup. Everything is urgent. And even though you just started, like her boss ends up just putting her on this high profile change and she just wants to do well. There's a lot of context that she just like doesn't know yet. But nevertheless, she has to move forward. Another example, Vanessa and Jim. Vanessa has started writing a ton of code lately, putting in extra time to hit a tough deadline, which means that there's a lot of code for her team to review. And so Jim gets assigned to review her code, but like Jim doesn't tell Vanessa that he's having some family trouble, kind of keeps everything inside. Things going on in the background that just like can't necessarily be solved in one day. And at work, Jim has been working on this particularly nasty bug. Woke up with a new plan of attack. He's ready for his new approach. And all Jim wants to do is find a bit of success, something that he can do well in this moment to make himself feel better. So he opens up his laptop, but there is that sneaking code review from Vanessa. And it is so much code to review. The only choice that Jim has to review this is to read it line by line, hop around the files, try to wrap his head around all of Vanessa's code. And he just doesn't have the capacity to do that. So Jim just lets Vanessa's code sit and unfortunately forgets to review it. Andrea, Vanessa, and Jim, just like the rest of us, we all just want to be respected, have self-actualization. We want to create and we want to be useful and solve problems. But we've got all this other stuff going on outside of work that can affect us. Our very identities can sometimes be wrapped up in the code that we write. And we just want to put something out there in the world that is just as brilliant and elegant and as cool as we think that we are. So throughout these stories, our code is a priority. Our process is paramount, but it is also important that we address the human aspect of our code reviews as part of the developer experience. The experience that we go through as developers is not only intermingled with our own internal narratives, but also sometimes our external narratives about the teams, the companies, our end users, sometimes even society as a whole. And in addition to those, we have just our experiences that are at our core, but our day-to-day experiences, our trauma, sometimes disabilities are all invisible to others, but they really truly affect us, particularly after the 2 years that we've had as a society. And for many of us, we've had to endure much more devastation for a lot longer. You can't assume that everyone is operating from the same mindset as you. Other examples might be Anxiety that you're going to break something, anxiety that you'll be judged if you get it wrong, guilt that you may stop your entire company from moving their thoughts forward into the world, all the time pressure that we have to ship code as quickly as possible, egos and prejudices, possibly shame, regret, and vulnerability. And you might be thinking, ugh, gross, feelings, why? Code is objective and we just have to put our feelings aside and write good code. So that begs the question, given these potential landmines that we may endure with our code review experiences, should we even do them in the first place? I'd like to argue, hopefully we can agree, that code reviews are incredibly important. They allow us to check code quality to make sure that it's up to the company standards, share their experiences and concerns. People can ask questions about impacts of the new code, address concerns, compare coding approaches, and most importantly, share our knowledge with others in a really rapid pace. We can build team trust and respect for one another, learn from the mistakes of others, and get hopefully well-intended advice on how to improve. So my recommendation is, let's not actually get rid of them. Why don't we try to optimize them? What I've found to be incredibly helpful in making a really amazing code review experience is to visualize doing a code review that's like finding your way through a maze. The author has created this maze that the reviewer needs to get through. You can think of your whole process of reviewing the code and figuring out what changed and why, building up that mental model as finding your way through the maze. But by the time you get to the other side, you figured out your way of the land, you're ready to give feedback and help make the change good enough to merge. But that maze that Ryan had to get through, that was not a fun maze. That was like finding your way through a maze in the dark with your hands tied behind your back while the walls are spiked and closing in on you. And there's a Minotaur that could attack you at any moment with a giant hammer. And that's not something that we are trying to do. We've got too much stuff, too many other ways to spend our time. But mazes, they don't actually have to be so bad. Mazes can be really, really fun. So what if that maze was a well-lit, elegant maze with no spikes? The walls were very, very, very still, and with a detailed map and clear signs on every turn, and all of the Minotaurs were asleep. What if we could do to our code reviews what we just did with the maze? They would suck a lot less. So how do we get through the code review maze? Remember the 3 M's, as I mentioned before. Let's build a nicer maze for people. Let's make a map, and let's remember to have empathy. So building a nicer maze. While you're coding, remember that you're like creating this puzzle that someone else is being forced to solve as their job. Make that puzzle as easy to solve as you can. Break down big chunks into manageable chunks, big tasks into manageable chunks. Easier said than done, I know, but a little planning up front really does go a long way. I know that it's really fun to kind of just jump in and start coding, but I promise if you spend some time planning things out first, you'll see ways of dividing up your work into smaller pieces. Write tests. Tests are not just for correctness. And as a reviewer, reading the test is a really great way to understand what the code is supposed to be doing, and add the comments about why. I know I'm stepping on a potential landmine here, but hear me out. If you don't know, there's a contingent of coders who think that the code should be self-documenting and that you don't need comments. But I want to make a quick case for one specific kind of comment. So the comment on the left explains what the code is doing. Not helpful. That's not what I'm recommending here. What I'm recommending is the comment on the right that explains why the code was written that way. These, I think, are really worth adding in, and they make all of our lives easier. So next, make a map. Making a map can be implemented in 3 ways: providing context, transferring your mental model, and an actual visual map. So making a map means providing your reviewer with some context. The person reviewing your code may not have all of the background that you have. Is it urgent fix that is blocking a critical deal? Is this touching a fiddly section of the code base that can easily take the site down. These are all good things to consider putting in your PR description or even in a PR template. A couple of other things that you can do. Link to the ticket or the spec, explaining why are we making this change, clarifying the urgency or explaining how dangerous the change is, and including any warnings to keep out for. Transferring your mental model. So you'll want to give some highlights of how you've implemented the change so that the reviewer knows right off the bat what you're looking for. Most reviews, one question your reviewer is going to have is, why did you build it this way instead of some other way? So I recommend just kind of going ahead and answering that right up front. Some things to think about. Was there a performance reason or security or just following the same pattern as the other file? Is there some quirk in the library that you're using? Those are just some things to think about. And finally, consider making an actual map. This can be as simple as explaining just where to start. You can make some suggestions of how to break the review down into smaller parts. Review one commit at a time is a common suggestion that you can do. And you can do all of that and more if you decide to make a walkthrough of your PR. You can point out where the most important changes are or where the code has just been moved around. And sometimes at the end of the day, maybe just what's best is to sit down and pair with your reviewer. Kind of going over the code together can sometimes be the easiest way to get everybody on the same page. So we've made a nicer maze, we've made a map, and finally remember to have empathy. People are not machines. We are people, not machines. We spend a lot of our day talking to computers, just being very direct and very clear and very matter of fact. But code reviews, we're talking to people. They have feelings, they've got personal lives, and we as a collective are just trying to learn and grow. Do you remember when you were a baby engineer? Remember how hard it was? You should really keep those things in mind when you're trying to review someone's code. Again, you've got no idea what's kind of happening in the background, or if this is a new area for someone. So just keep those things in mind. Be nice. I can't teach you how to be a nice person in the next 3 minutes, but 2 very simple pieces of advice. Don't assume. Don't assume that the other person thinks the same as you. Be curious and ask questions. Never make it personal. We're just talking about the code and not talking about the people. If you're looking for advice on this, there are some really great resources out there that I love. Read these cover to cover. Nonviolent communication and crucial conversations are 2 of my absolute favorites, particularly just general communication, but really helps to provide your whole team a basis on how to talk to each other, particularly in tricky situations like code reviews. Be clear. So quick story, I know a guy named Matt. He would get very anxious every time there was a comment on his PR. He would think that every comment was criticism. Someone might just be asking me a question, but Matt would think that he'd done something wrong and completely, totally rewrote his code. And eventually Matt and his team came up with a solution. They simply just started using emojis at the beginning of each of their comments so they could be clear with each other about intent. And the misunderstanding stopped. So here are just a couple of examples for whether the comment is a blocker or whether it's a non-blocker. So you can just be very, very clear. Emojis are great, but there's a more complete system called conventional comments that you might want to use or adapt. Feel free to check all of that stuff out. So I started looking for tools that encompass all of this advice because it's a lot. And of course, I didn't find anything. So that's kind of how CodeSee was born. It's our mission to help developers master the understanding of code bases. We're a tool, a dev tool that visually helps you to understand how your code works so you can onboard to code bases faster, plan your code better, and generate visual maps of your code reviews. At CodeSee, we believe that encompassing all of this advice and putting it into a tool makes your lives and your team's lives a lot easier to manage. We're at the beginning of our journey, but want to put CodeSee aside for a minute because this really isn't about us, it's about you. Your code reviews really should be less frustrating and easier. Better understanding means better quality code reviews. It means fewer silos for code, and your teammates will get along better because they feel supported, respected, and appreciated. So let's get back to Jonah and Ryan's story. What happened next? Jonah started over. He made a plan to deliver it into small chunks. He posted one code change at a time. With each one, he gave a map of his change and offered to pair. And when Ryan had feedback or questions, Jonah responded patiently and thoughtfully. They just used emojis. But eventually, what ended up happening was the code got better. One by one, the 7 PRs got reviewed and merged. Did it take longer for Jonah? Absolutely. But posting that first giant change didn't get good feedback and it never got merged. And if your code never get merged, did it actually really happen? So this one did get merged, and that was what was important. And Jonah and Ryan trusted and respected each other more now as a result. So if we believe that code reviews are worth doing, then we should write reviews that are doable. We as engineers have been living in a world that's a little bit more painful and inefficient and harder than it needs to be. But the good news is that our practices, mindsets, and tools that we can engage in to make our day-to-day lives easier with reviewing each other's code empowers us to get more done. And there are tools on the horizon to help. So I challenge you to recognize the deep humanity being surfaced in our code reviews. Come up with visual systems if you can, for not only for yourself, and make this a priority for all of your teammates and possibly our whole ecosystem as a whole, so that we can live in a world where our day-to-day experience doesn't suck. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a ton for your presentation right now, just now. So I would like to ask 1 or 2 questions on the topic. So the first, we're always interested in learning more, and I think one thing that is particularly interesting about your talk just now was that it touched both on tools, but also on these cultural elements in a company.
Yeah.
And from experiences, those are a lot harder to change and a lot harder to teach also. So I can only imagine that it's very, very difficult to teach people the right communication in comments, right? And you did recommend 2 books. And we know Nonviolent Communication, great book, but quite a long read. So first question is just, are there more resources that are kind of low entry barrier, maybe blogs or I don't know, podcasts, something that talks about this topic that people can go into if they're interested?
Yeah. I have pinned just great summaries, like book summaries. You can just type in like nonviolent communication summary or crucial conversation summary. Some are longer than others. I'm happy to post the links that I personally reference. I've read both books, but having that blog post of a summary pinned really makes it like a quick way to like go and grab how you're making it safe to talk to others, like what's your mutual framework, etc. Those things. So definitely you can just Google like book summary. It really does help.
And going a tiny bit deeper into code reviews, you talked about also addressing the why, not only the what.
Yeah.
That's also, it sounds like great advice, and it also sounds very difficult to implement because when is it important? I would say it requires a little bit of contextual knowledge, perhaps about other users that will, tamper later down the road with your code base. Are there any rules of thumbs, principles, something to kind of adhere to when more context might be required and when less?
Yeah. So if your like review is like over like 200 lines, you probably should say why. Like if it's or if there's like a particular tricky part, or if there's a particular like something that might not be super obvious. Like for the example that I showed is like from our code base, where like the obvious thing to do is do this pan and then zoom kind of in our visual way, but like because of a quirk in our framework, like you have to do the zoom and then the pan, but like no one would really know that, right? And so those are the things that you should explain, like, hey, this is why it's this way. It's a bug in the framework that we're using. It's non-obvious, right? And so those are it works a little bit unexpectedly. So those are the ones that I'm advocating for, really having a comment for,
That's one good rule of thumb already, is you have to explain everything that relates to a bug that you know about, and you will keep it for whatever reason. So one very quick one that was raised in the comments. Can you share again the names of the 2 books that you recommended, and we will put them in the comments actually. So let me write along.
It's Crucial Conversations, Carrie Patterson, and then Nonviolent Communication. Highly recommend those books. Like, cannot recommend them enough. The other one that might be a good resource, particularly for giving feedback, is literally called Thanks for Your Feedback. It's really about how to give to not only be a good feedback giver, but a good feedback receiver, right? I don't think that we talk enough about how we receive feedback, and what are the right types of feedback to be giving. How should we interpret those things? And so highly recommend that.
Those are great recommendations, and I think we should invite you to our next offsite at Gitpod.
Absolutely.
Because these are topics that we're interested in our team as well. So my final question: so we like open source, and we think about how to make open source kind of more approachable in a way, and easier. And on the one hand, you want to lower the barrier to contribute, but then also you often create a burden on maintainers.
Yep.
Go through all the PR. So as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking, what can open source maintainers take from this? Perhaps are there like best practices in terms of how they should set up their READMEs or their documentation to kind of facilitate better code in terms of comments and clarity, structure, all of these elements of communication that you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually try to recommend to open source maintainers the same things that we'd recommend working in a regular company. They're all like having to manage a code base and having to manage people that need to write code and then do reviews and merges and all of those things. They're basically almost identical. Shameless plug for CodeSee, but that is really helpful to basically visualize how your code base works. We talk to maintainers all the time, love the open source community, want to be able to support as much as we can. And onboarding and lowering the barrier to entry to figure out how to start, where to start, what are best practices. So what are patterns that contributors should be able to duplicate really easily? Being able to kind of set up when they can get support, like when is someone actually going to be available to answer their questions? What time zones are people located in, so that people can feel like they have somewhere to direct like where they're supposed to go. All of that you can put in your README. You can also put that in your in one of our communities called OSS Port. We're trying to help with that problem as well. However, like making sure that contributors know how to contribute, where they should follow practices that they can really duplicate, and being able to do basically the same things that we recommend to companies, trying to make that process as easy as possible, helps contributors to contribute to the project, which ultimately ends up helping the maintainer as well. If you have more people contributing, you'll move more into management instead of kind of writing the code. And so it's definitely a trade-off that the maintainer has to make, but definitely recommend just coming at it from that perspective.
Very much. Well, thanks a lot. This was very practical advice, which we like a lot. I think it has some very concrete takeaways. Thanks a lot for taking the time to join us here at DevExConf and to stick around for some questions. And yeah, we hope to see you again with
Same
our
here.
next edition.
I'm super excited. Thank you so much for having me. It's really such a pleasure.